Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a very slow, very boring journey back in time to a period when the very earth beneath your feet became something more. You're standing on a rugged, sun-baked hill, maybe in what we now call modern-day Turkey, or perhaps a bit further east. The air is dry, and the only sound is the gentle whisper of the wind through the tall, golden grasses. Below you, a small, dusty village goes about its day. There are no sounds of clanging metal, no blacksmith's hammer ringing out, just the soft rhythm of a stone grinding against grain, the distant bleating of a goat. Life is slow, repetitive, and entirely reliant on stone, wood, and bone. You are living in a time before the Bronze Age, and your most advanced tool is a piece of obsidian, razor sharp but brittle. It can break in an instant, and once it does, you have to start over from scratch. The idea of taking a rock and melting it down into a liquid, then shaping it into a tool that would never dull, never shatter, would sound like pure magic. It would be a power you could barely comprehend, something spoken of only in whispered myths. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment below with your location and local time, so we can all feel a little less alone out here in the quiet digital cosmos. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You close your eyes and breathe in the dusty air of this long ago world. You feel the rough, woolen fabric of your simple tunic against your skin. This is the Chalcolithic period, a time that history books sometimes refer to as the Copper Age. It's a bit of a placeholder, really, a transitional era that sits awkwardly between the Stone Age you just left behind and the much more famous Bronze Age that's waiting for us just around the corner. But this period is where our story truly begins, with a discovery so simple it seems almost impossible that it took us so long to find it. People in this time are not yet great miners, not in the way we think of it today. They are more like keen-eyed beachcombers of the earth. They notice things. They pick up rocks that are different, rocks that have a strange weight to them, a color that seems almost unnatural compared to the dull grays and browns around them. One of those rocks is a type of ore, and it's a rock that happens to contain native copper. Now, native is just a fancy word for saying it's a pure metal, found in its natural state, not bound up with other minerals. It's soft, so soft you can probably shape it just by hammering it with another rock. You're not smelting it, not yet. You're just cold hammering it, which is the technical term for making a tool by hitting a rock with another rock. You pound it into a rough shape, maybe a small, blunt knife, or a simple awl for punching holes in leather. It's an interesting curiosity, a little toy, but not a revolution. You see, the copper you can find this way is incredibly rare, and the tools you make from it are not really any better than the sharpened flint you've been using for generations. A flint blade will cut better, stay sharper, longer. The copper knife just looks pretty. It's an interesting material for trinkets, maybe a little decorative pin for your cloak, but it's not going to change your world, not yet. Historians still argue whether the first use of copper was a deliberate search for a new material or a happy accident of curiosity. Did someone see a strange green-tinged rock and think, I wonder what happens if I hit this with a hammer? Or did they find a piece of pure copper glistening in a riverbed and realize its unique properties? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The initial excitement was likely limited to its ornamental value. Think of it like a shiny new gadget that everyone wants to show off, but nobody really knows what to do with. You can make little beads, a decorative pendant for your necklace. You can trade it to a neighboring village and feel a bit special, a bit important for having something so unique. It's a small, quiet change, a shift in the way people think about the things they pull from the ground. But the real revolution, the one that will transform your society and eventually give the entire era its name, is still to come. We're on the precipice of a discovery that will literally melt your mind. But for now, you just have to wait. You are still there in the quiet, dusty hills, watching a world that is about to change forever, though it doesn't know it yet. You've seen the soft, native copper, and you've seen the humble, decorative pins it can be made into. But now, let's imagine a different scenario. You're not just a passive observer anymore. You're an active participant. You're helping to stoke a fire, a simple campfire that has been burning for a long, long time. Perhaps you're cooking a meal or just trying to keep warm as the sun sets. And near the edge of the fire, where the coals glow red and the heat is most intense, there is a rock. It's not just any rock. It's one of those unusual blue-green rocks that people sometimes find. A rock we now know as copper, or the fire is hot, but not impossibly hot. Maybe just around 1000 degrees Celsius, which is the kind of temperature you can get in a well-stoked hearth. It's not a volcanic eruption, just a good, strong blaze. As you sit there, you might notice something strange. A small, liquid bead of metal starts to ooze from the rock, almost like a tear. It's a glistening, reddish-orange blob, and as it cools, it hardens into a small, shiny nugget. What you just witnessed, completely by accident, is the dawn of metallurgy. This wasn't a deliberate experiment. It was a happy, sleepy accident, a coincidence of a hot fire and a lucky rock. The heat from the fire had been enough to break the chemical bonds holding the copper in the ore, freeing it from the rock and allowing it to melt. This process is called smelting, and it is one of the most important technological leaps in human history. It's the difference between finding a small, soft piece of metal you can hammer into a pin and being able to melt down a whole pile of rocks and turn it into a river of molten copper that you can pour into any shape you want. You can imagine the first person who saw this. They must have thought it was magic, that the rocks themselves were crying tears of metal. The idea of turning a hard, inert stone into a fluid that could be molded and shaped was a complete paradigm shift. It's the kind of discovery that probably had people talking for generations, a story passed down around countless campfires. Remember the time old Grog accidentally made a metal tear from that funny-looking rock? He thought the gods were speaking to him, and in a way, they were. The gods of physics and chemistry, just doing their thing. This is a mainstream historical fact. The understanding that smelting was likely discovered accidentally in an open hearth. Now, here's a slightly quirky tidbit. Historians still argue over whether the first smelting was of copper or of lead. Lead melts at a lower temperature, so it's a bit more plausible that someone stumbled upon it first. But lead is soft, useless for tools, and it's also highly toxic. So, while you could make some very pretty, very heavy trinkets out of lead, you'd also get very sick very quickly. It's not a revolution, it's just a shiny path to an early grave. Copper, on the other hand, was the perfect candidate. It melts at a temperature high enough to require a serious fire, but low enough to be achievable. in a simple pit. It's soft, yes, but it can be hardened through a process called work hardening, which is just the fancy term for hammering it a lot. This process makes it stronger and more durable, a definite improvement over a fragile flint blade. The ability to create a material from scratch, to essentially turn rock into something new, was a game changer. It meant you were no longer at the mercy of finding native copper. You could now actively seek out the ores, knowing you could transform them into a useful product. This shifted the focus of human enterprise from simply foraging for what was available to a more proactive, industrial mindset. It created a need for new skills and new roles in society. You needed people who knew how to find the right rocks, people who understood how to build a fire hot enough to melt them, and people who knew how to shape the molten metal. The age of the specialist was beginning. The humble, stone-wielding forager was about to be replaced by the skilled, almost magical metal worker. The world was about to get a lot more complex, a lot more interconnected, and a lot more metal. The quiet life you were living just a few moments ago is about to get a lot louder, filled with the ringing of hammers and the roaring of furnaces. But for now, you can just lie back, imagine the soft glow of that first fire, and let the gentle sounds of this new beginning lull you to sleep. With the discovery of smelting now a reality, you find yourself drawn to the glow of the furnace. The simple campfire has been replaced by something more deliberate, a pit in the ground, lined with clay, stoked with air from a primitive bellows, maybe just a hollow tube someone blows through. The process is still clunky, still inefficient, but it works. And what you are working with, primarily, is copper. Now, copper is an interesting metal. It's soft, which we've already established. If you were to make a knife out of pure copper, it would bend the moment you tried to cut anything harder than a ripe melon. It would be a frustrating experience, like trying to cut a steak with a butter knife. It's pretty, it's malleable, but it is not a tool of great utility, at least not yet. Mainstream historical fact time. Early copper tools, before the discovery of alloying, were often used for things that didn't require a sharp, hard edge. Things like awls for punching holes in leather, small chisels for shaping wood, and decorative items. It was a metal of convenience and status, not of necessity. The real work of building, hunting, and fighting was still done with good old-fashioned stone and bone. You might have a fancy copper axe head, but it would dull almost instantly if you tried to chop down a tree with it. So you'd likely use it for ceremonial purposes, something to show off at a trade meeting, not something you'd take out into the forest to get firewood. The copper tools were a bit like a modern-day commemorative coin, nice to look at, but not something you'd use to buy your groceries. But this isn't to say copper was useless. On the contrary, its softness was actually a benefit in some cases. You could easily reshape a bent tool, and you could make incredibly intricate things that were impossible with stone. Think of a copper wire, which you could pull into a long, thin strand to make a hook for fishing or a clasp for a piece of jewelry. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the surprisingly delicate copper jewelry found in some archaeological sites. Archaeologists have discovered tiny, coiled rings and intricate pendants, suggesting a level of craftsmanship that belies the simple, brutish image of the Copper Age. The ability to make something so fine and detailed was a massive step forward, even if the tools themselves were still a bit flimsy. The tools of this era were a bit like the first generation of any new technology. They were clunky, a little unreliable, and not quite up to the task of completely replacing the old way of doing things. Historians still debate whether this early reliance on copper was a true technological leap or simply a cultural one, a matter of fashion and prestige rather than practicality. Was the copper axe a symbol of a new elite class, a look at me, I have metal statement, or was it a genuinely useful, if limited, tool? The answer is probably both. The people who controlled the flow of copper, the people who knew how to smelt it, were almost certainly seen as powerful and important. They held the secret to a new kind of power, and that power, even if it was just the power to make a shiny, soft bracelet, was a valuable commodity. So, as you drift off, imagine yourself working with this soft, pliable metal. You're not trying to build a fortress or conquer a neighboring tribe with it. You're simply making a small, beautiful object, a copper clasp for your cloak. You're tapping it gently with a small stone hammer, shaping the metal with care, feeling the way it yields to your touch. The finished product isn't strong, but it is beautiful. It is a sign of a new beginning, a whisper of the metal revolution to come. The soft glow of the copper reflects the firelight, and for a moment you feel like a magician, turning a dull rock into something precious. It's a peaceful, quiet process, a world away from the clanging and banging that would eventually define this new age. The gentle glow of the copper you've been working with fades from your imagination as you fall a little deeper into this world. The realization has dawned on the people of this age that if you want more metal, you can't just wait for the rare, naturally occurring chunks of native copper to appear. You have to go looking for the right rocks, the ores. And this means you have to go into the earth itself. So you're now a miner, though not in the modern sense of the word. There are no helmets with lights, no automated drills, just you, a few friends, and a lot of stones. Your tools are simple: a hard stone hammer, an antler pick, and some wooden wedges. The work is slow and incredibly dangerous. Mainstream historical fact: the earliest mines for copper ore were simple open pits, shallow depressions dug into the earth where the ore was visible at the surface. Over time, these pits became deeper, and eventually, people began to dig horizontally into the hillsides, creating small adits, which are horizontal tunnels. These tunnels were narrow, often so small you had to crawl on your belly to get through them. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a flickering oil lamp or a fire. The noise was constant, the rhythmic thud of stone against stone, the scraping of picks against rock. It was a monotonous, backbreaking existence. The job wasn't just about digging, it was about knowing what to look for. You're not looking for any old rock. You're looking for a specific type of rock, one that has a distinctive greenish or bluish tint, a sign that it contains copper. You're looking for malachite or azurite, the beautiful stones that will eventually become our metal. A quirky or fringe tidbit about these early mines is the discovery of what archaeologists call mining deaths. These are not just skeletons found in a mine. They're bodies that have been crushed by rockfalls or trapped in collapsed tunnels. In one ancient copper mine in what is now Austria, a man was found preserved by the cold, dry conditions, still clutching his primitive tools, his body wedged in a narrow crevice. His story is a silent testament to the very real dangers of this work. He wasn't a hero or a warrior. He was a worker, a common person who risked his life for a rock. These were the unsung heroes of the Bronze Age, the people whose labor made the entire thing possible. The question of why people were willing to take such risks for a metal that was still, in many ways, inferior to stone is one historians still debate. Was it driven by a desire for wealth, a desire for power, or something more fundamental? Perhaps it was simply the promise of a better life, a chance to escape the quiet tedium of farming or hunting. Or maybe it was a need for something more spiritual. The mines were often seen as sacred places, entrances to the underworld where the gods held sway. The metal itself was a gift from these deities, and the miners were their chosen servants. You can almost feel the spiritual weight of the earth as you crawl on your hands and knees, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The air is still heavy with the smell of damp earth and smoke, and every swing of your stone hammer is a prayer, a plea to the gods to keep the earth from swallowing you whole. The mining operation was not just a solo effort. It was a communal activity, a collaborative dance of risk and reward. You would have worked in small groups, with one person swinging the pick, another hauling out the rubble in a leather bag, and another tending the fire to keep the lamps burning. There's a certain intimacy to this kind of work, a sense of shared purpose that comes from facing a common danger together. The sounds of your labor, the thudding and scraping, become a kind of rhythm, a prehistoric beat that lulls you deeper and deeper into the earth, and perhaps a little deeper into a peaceful, dreamless sleep. The claustrophobic darkness of the mines gives way to the open air once more, but the work is far from over. You have your ore, those strange, heavy, greenish rocks. They aren't pretty anymore. They're just heavy, dirty stones that need to be transformed. The next step is a process that is both simple and, at the same time, profoundly complex: smelting crude ores. You've learned that a simple campfire won't cut it for this kind of work. It was a good starting point, but now you need to be more deliberate. You need a furnace. The early furnaces of this era were not the giant bellow-driven behemoths we might imagine today. They were small, simple structures, usually just a shallow pit dug into the ground and lined with clay. You would build a low wall of stones around the pit to help contain the heat, maybe a foot or two high. This is where the magic happens. And by magic, I mean chemistry. But to you, it would certainly feel like sorcery. Into this pit, you would carefully place your copper, or broken into small pieces. You then build a fire on top of and around the ore, a roaring, hungry fire fed by a constant supply of charcoal. This is a mainstream historical fact. The development of these small, simple pit furnaces marks a key step in moving from accidental metallurgy to a deliberate craft. The process is slow, and it's a bit of a guessing game. You don't have a thermometer, of course. You have to judge the temperature by the color of the flames and the look of the glowing coals. You know you need to get the temperature up to about 1085 degrees Celsius to melt the copper, but the ore itself is full of impurities, bits of rock, dirt, and other minerals that don't melt at the same temperature. These impurities are what you need to get rid of. As the ore heats up and melts, the heavier, purer copper sinks to the bottom of your pit, while the lighter, unwanted rock and minerals float on top. This waste material, which we now call slag, is a glassy, often blackish substance that you can skim off the top. It's a bit like making soup and having to skim the fat off the surface, just a lot more dangerous and a whole lot hotter. A quirky or fringe tidbit about this process is how these ancient smiths dealt with the issue of oxygen. Copper, when heated, loves to react with oxygen, which can make it brittle and useless. The charcoal fire they used was the perfect solution because a hot charcoal fire burns with very little oxygen. It creates what chemists call a reducing atmosphere, which is a fancy way of saying it's a loxygen environment that helps separate the metal from the ore. The ancient smiths didn't know the science behind it, of course, but they knew that the right kind of fire, a deep, hot charcoal fire, was the key to making good, workable metal. It was a bit like a secret recipe, a technique passed down from master to apprentice, without ever needing to understand the underlying principles of metallurgy. Historians still debate whether this knowledge was discovered independently in different parts of the world, or if it was a single innovation that spread through trade and migration. Did someone in what is now Iran figure it out and then teach someone in Egypt, who then taught someone in Europe? Or did different people, separated by vast distances, all accidentally discover the same thing at roughly the same time? It's one of those big, unanswerable questions that makes history so much fun to think about. For now, you can just imagine yourself standing over that glowing pit, the heat of the fire on your face, the smell of burning wood and minerals in the air, the long hours of digging in the mine, the backbreaking journey to bring the ore to the furnace. All of it culminates in this one moment, this slow, painstaking process of turning a common rock into a valuable, beautiful, and utterly magical metal. The heat from the smelting pit is intense, a physical presence that pushes against you. You've just spent a full day feeding the furnace, watching as the raw ore begins its slow transformation. But the fire you're using isn't just any fire. It's not just a pile of sticks you gathered from the forest floor. You have to be more deliberate. The fuel you're using is charcoal, a substance that might look like burnt wood, but is, in fact, a crucial, almost magical ingredient in the smelting process. You're not just a smelter. You're also a charcoal maker, a kind of pre-industrial alchemist in your own right. To make charcoal, you have to build a special kind of fire. You can't just burn wood in the open air, because that would turn it to ash. Instead, you have to burn it in a loxygen environment. You would build a large pile of wood, covering it with a layer of earth and turf, leaving just a few small holes for ventilation. Then you would light it and let it smolder for several days, maybe even a week. The wood doesn't burn, it carbonizes. It slowly cooks, driving out all the water and other volatile compounds, leaving behind a porous, lightweight black substance that is almost pure carbon. This is a mainstream historical fact. The production of charcoal in large earthen kilns was a massive industry that supported the entire Bronze Age. Without charcoal, there would be no Bronze Age. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the process of making charcoal was so vital and so sensitive that entire forests were managed specifically for this purpose. The charcoal makers would learn to read the smoke coming from the kiln. A white, thick smoke meant it was working correctly, but a thin, dark smoke meant something was wrong and the whole batch might be ruined. They were the original smoke whisperers, listening to the subtle messages of the burning wood. The smell would have been a constant part of life in these communities, a mix of damp earth and the sweet, woody scent of the smoldering pile. And it was a job that required patience, foresight, and a deep understanding of how fire behaves, a wisdom that was passed down through generations. Historians still debate whether the development of charcoal was an independent discovery or a consequence of the new demands of metallurgy. Did someone accidentally discover how to make charcoal and then realize it was a great fuel for smelting? Or did the need for a hotter fire lead them to experiment with different fuels, eventually landing on charcoal as the perfect solution? The answer is probably a bit of both, but what's clear is that the relationship between the two technologies was symbiotic. Charcoal made smelting possible, and the demand for metal made charcoal a necessity. The charcoal itself is the key. It burns much hotter and more cleanly than wood. It doesn't produce the smoke and ash that would clog up your furnace and contaminate your metal. It's like the difference between a sputtering, smoky campfire and a clean-burning gas stove. The charcoal provides the high, steady heat you need to transform your ore into liquid copper. It also provides that all-important reducing atmosphere, that oxygen environment we talked about, which prevents the copper from oxidizing and becoming brittle. So you're not just throwing wood on a fire. You're carefully placing each piece of charcoal, listening to the crackle and pop, watching the glow of the furnace as it slowly, deliberately melts down the earth and turns it into liquid. It's a slow, hypnotic process, a dance between wood and rock, fire and metal. With the charcoal now glowing white-hot in your furnace, the copper, or slowly giving up its liquid treasure, you might think the story of the Bronze Age has reached its climax. But this is just the end of the first act. We've made copper, and it's a beautiful, shiny metal. But remember how soft it is. It's a great material for a decorative pin, but it's not going to win you any wars or help you plow a field. The real revolution, the one that gives this era its name, is still to come, and it happens, once again, in a quiet, unassuming way. This is the moment of the accidental alloy. You see, copper ore doesn't always come in a pure, unadulterated form. It's a rock, after all, and rocks are messy. They're full of other stuff. Sometimes a copper ore deposit would be found right next to a deposit of another, much rarer, or this other, or contained a substance that was completely unremarkable on its own. Tin. Tin is a soft, silvery white metal that you could find a few places in the world. It's pretty useless for tools. You can bend a tin sword with your bare hands. But what would happen if you were to accidentally mix these two seemingly useless metals together in your furnace? Perhaps a batch of copper, or you dug up from a different vein, happened to have some tin or mixed in. You wouldn't know it, of course. You'd just be smelting your copper as usual. But something different would happen. The molten metal that pours out of your furnace would look a little different. It would be a slightly different color, and it would cool down in a way that was new to you. When you hammer this new metal, you'd find it was harder, much harder. It wouldn't bend when you hit it. It would hold an edge. You could make a knife that actually cut things, a spearhead that stayed sharp, an axe that could chop wood without deforming. You'd have just created bronze, the alloy that would change the world. This is a mainstream historical fact. Bronze is a metal alloy consisting primarily of copper, usually with about 10 to 12% tin. The deliberate creation of this alloy through the careful mixing of the two metals is what marks the true beginning of the Bronze Age. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the first instances of bronze production were likely not a controlled, scientific process, but a matter of sheer luck and observation. The first bronze makers probably noticed that the ore from a certain mine always produced a better, harder metal. They might have attributed this to the gods blessing that particular piece of land, or perhaps to some secret, magical property of the rocks from that area. They wouldn't have known it was a different chemical element causing the change. The recipe for good metal would have been less of a chemical formula and more of a geographical secret. You want good metal? Go get the rocks from that hill over there, the one with the funny-looking flowers growing on it. Historians still debate whether the accidental discovery of bronze happened in multiple places at once, or if it was a single innovation that spread. Was it a lucky coincidence in a village in what is now modern-day Iran, a place known for early metallurgy, or did it happen simultaneously in different parts of the world wherever copper and tin or deposits were found close together? It's another one of those big, beautiful mysteries that make history so much fun to untangle. For now, you can just imagine the moment of that discovery, the quiet surprise and awe. You're holding a tool that is stronger, more durable, and more reliable than anything you've ever held before. The light from your furnace glints off its new gold-like surface, and you know, deep in your sleepy bones, that your world has just been changed forever. Discovering bronze is such a game changer, right? But it also brings a whole new challenge. You might find yourself accidentally whipping up a few batches of this amazing metal, and honestly, it can be a bit overwhelming. What do you think? But you don't know why it worked. You've noticed that some of your ore produces this magical, hard metal, while others just produce the soft, bendable copper you've always known. What's the difference? You begin to realize that the secret ingredient, the key to unlocking this new technology, is that rare and elusive partner, tin. Finding tin is not like finding copper. Copper ore is often found in visible veins with its distinctive blue-green color. It's a bit like a neon sign telling you where to dig. Tin, on the other hand, is much more subtle. Its primary, or cassiterite, often looks like a boring, blackish-brown rock. It doesn't have the vibrant colors of copper, or it's not found in the same kinds of places. You have to actively hunt for it, and the places where it can be found are few and far between. This is a mainstream historical fact. The sources of tin were incredibly scarce and geographically limited, with major deposits being found in places like modern-day Afghanistan, Central Asia, and, most famously, Cornwall in Britain. The search for tin would become one of the primary drivers of trade and exploration for the entire Bronze Age. The hunt for tin would have been a long, grueling, and often fruitless endeavor. You and your fellow prospectors would have to travel far from your home village into unknown territories, guided only by rumors and the faintest whispers of geological knowledge. Maybe you'd hear a story from a distant trader about a heavy, black stone that makes metal stronger when you mix it with the shiny, red stuff. This is the kind of information that would send you on a weeks-long journey, crossing treacherous mountains and vast plains, just to find a rock that might not even be what you're looking for. This geographical constraint meant that the people who had access to both copper and tin were suddenly in a position of immense power. They held the keys to a technological revolution, and they were not going to give up that secret easily. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that tin mining was often a completely different process from copper mining. While copper was mined in deep, underground shafts, tin ore was often found in riverbeds, washed down from its source in the mountains. This is called placer mining. You would pan for it, much like gold prospectors did thousands of years later. You'd sift through the river gravel, looking for those heavy, black grains of cassiterite. This was a slow, meditative, and often solitary process, a far cry from the noisy communal labor of a copper mine. The quiet hiss of the river, the gentle clinking of stones as you sifted through them, would have been the soundtrack to the tin hunt. It was a peaceful, if tedious, job, but the prize at the end of it was the most valuable commodity in the world. Historians still debate which tin sources were the most important in the early Bronze Age. Was it the tin from the mountains of Central Asia that first fueled the Mesopotamian civilizations? Or was it the tin from the distant, mysterious lands of Britain that would eventually feed the vast European trade networks? The answer is a bit of a moving target, as new archaeological evidence is constantly being uncovered. What's clear is that the scarcity of tin made it an incredibly valuable commodity, a driver of innovation, trade, and even conflict. It was the oil of the Bronze Age, and everyone wanted a piece of it. So, as you drift off to sleep, imagine yourself by a quiet river, your hands sifting through the cold water, the rhythmic clatter of the gravel lulling you into a peaceful slumber. You're not just looking for a rock, you're looking for the future. With a precious, small amount of tin ore now in your possession, you've returned to your furnace. The trial and error is about to begin. The discovery of bronze wasn't an instant perfection. It was a long, slow process of figuring out the right mix. You're not a chemist with a beaker and a scale. You're a smith with a glowing pit and a good eye. This is the era of the first bronze alloys, and they were often inconsistent, a testament to the messy reality of ancient metallurgy. You can imagine yourself experimenting, adding a little more tin here, a little less there, and watching with a mix of hope and anxiety. The mainstream historical fact here is that the percentage of tin in bronze is absolutely critical to little tin, and the metal is only slightly harder than pure copper. It's a good effort, but not a game changer. Too much tin, and the metal becomes brittle. It's hard, yes, but it will shatter like glass if you hit it with a good, solid blow. The sweet spot, as you would eventually discover, is around 10 to 12% tin. This proportion creates a metal that is not only much harder and stronger than copper, but is also less prone to cracking when it's being worked. It also has a lower melting point than pure copper, which is a big help. It means you don't have to get your furnace quite as hot, saving you precious charcoal and time. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the very first bronze alloys were likely accidental in a different sense than the first accidental smeltings. These were not deliberate attempts to create a new alloy. They were the result of a smith mixing tin with copper and seeing what happened. These early attempts often had very little tin, maybe just 1% or 2%. The metal that came out of the furnace was a bit better, a bit harder, but not the revolutionary material we think of today. It was a slow, incremental improvement, not a sudden leap. The early bronze smiths were just learning to walk before they could run, feeling their way forward in the dark. This is a point where historians still debate the exact timeline and process. Did the earliest smiths stumble upon the optimal mixture through sheer luck, or was it a gradual process of refinement that took centuries? Was the knowledge of the perfect recipe a carefully guarded secret, or was it something that spread slowly as people learned by doing? The archaeological record shows a gradual increase in the tin content of bronze artifacts over time, suggesting a slow, deliberate process of experimentation. The early, inconsistent artifacts are a testament to this learning curve. You might find a beautiful dagger from this era that is 5% tin, and a simple axe from the same period that is 8% tin, showing a lack of standardized production. So, you're standing over your small clay furnace, the molten metal glowing. You carefully pour it into a simple stone mold, the liquid flowing like a golden river. As it cools, you can't help but feel a sense of anticipation. You have no idea if this batch is going to be the perfect, strong bronze you've heard whispers about, or if it's going to be a brittle, useless disappointment. It's a peaceful, quiet moment of suspense. The air is still, save for the crackle of the embers. You're a scientist without the science, a chef without a recipe, just you and the raw, unpredictable forces of the earth. The secret of bronze has been discovered, and you now have a reliable recipe for a stronger, more useful metal. But what good is a secret if you're the only one who knows it? The knowledge of how to make bronze and the raw materials to do so was far too valuable to stay in one place. And so, a new kind of quiet revolution begins, the spread of this knowledge through a vast, interconnected network of trade. This is the era of the traveling knowledge. The secrets of smelting and alloying didn't travel on a scroll or in a book, of course. They traveled in the minds of people. The mainstream historical fact is that the Bronze Age was a period of unprecedented long-distance trade. The scarcity of tin, in particular, created a huge demand for a complex network of trade routes. Copper sources were found in many places, but tin was rare and often found far from where the copper was mined. This created a need for specialized traders, people who would travel for months or even years at a time, carrying precious metals and ores from one end of the known world to the other. They were the original CEOs of the Bronze Age, the quiet connectors who linked different cultures and economies together. You can imagine yourself as one of these traders, trundling along a dusty path, your donkey laden with heavy ingots of tin, the sun hot on your back. You're not just carrying metal, you're carrying prosperity, power, and the future. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that these trade routes were often not just for metal. The people who traveled them would also carry other valuable goods, things we might not think of as essential today. They would trade amber from the Baltic Sea, glass beads from Egypt, and spices from the East. The trade in bronze was the economic engine, but the routes themselves were vibrant arteries of cultural exchange. You might have heard a story about a far-off land from a trader, learned a new word in a different language, or seen a piece of jewelry made in a style you'd never seen before. These traders were not just merchants. They were the storytellers and news reporters of the ancient world. They were the ones who kept everyone connected, even if they were thousands of miles apart. Historians still debate the extent to which this knowledge was deliberately guarded as a secret versus it simply being a natural consequence of the slow spread of technology. Did a smith in Mesopotamia purposefully refuse to teach his techniques to a trader from Egypt? Or was it a matter of a new apprentice slowly learning a trade over many years? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The skills were complex and required a long apprenticeship, so it's not like you could just write down the recipe and send it off in a letter. The knowledge had to be passed on, in person, from master to student. This made the spread of the technology slow but incredibly resilient. Once a new place had the knowledge, they had it for good. So, as you drift off to sleep, imagine the slow, steady rhythm of a caravan moving across a vast, empty landscape. The only sounds are the rhythmic clip-clop of the animals and the soft rustle of the wind. You're not just a farmer, a hunter, or a smith anymore. You're a part of something bigger, a global network of people and ideas, all connected by the quiet, powerful desire for a better tool, a stronger weapon, and a more prosperous life. The rhythmic shuffle of the caravan fades, and you're back in the heart of a village. But things are different now. The humble fire pit has been replaced by a proper workshop. The smith isn't just a random villager who happens to be good with rocks. He's a specialized craftsman, a figure of respect, and a little bit of mystery. You see, the life of a Bronze Age smith was a world away from the common farmer. He didn't work in the fields or hunt in the forests. His world was a small, dark hut filled with the tools of his trade and the glow of his furnace. This is the life of a Bronze Age smith. Mainstream historical fact. The smith was one of the first true specialists in society. Before him, everyone was a generalist. They farmed, they hunted, they built their own homes. But the knowledge of how to smelt, or to mix it in the right proportions, to cast it into a mold, and to hammer it into a useful tool, was a skill that took years to master. This made the smith a powerful and important figure. He was the village doctor, a weapons expert, and a creator of wealth, all rolled into one. His presence in a community meant prosperity and a degree of power that other, less fortunate villages could only dream of. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the smith was often seen as a magical figure. People didn't understand the chemistry of what he was doing. They just saw him take a pile of dull, ordinary rocks and transform them into a gleaming, golden tool that was harder and stronger than anything they had ever seen. He was a master of fire and metal, a person who could command the very elements to do his bidding. This led to a lot of folklore and mythology surrounding the smith. In many cultures, the smith was a god, a hero, or a shaman, a figure who straddled the line between the mortal and the divine. The smithy wasn't just a workshop. It was a sacred space, a place where a man communed with the raw power of the earth. Historians still debate whether the smith was a part of the warrior elite or a separate artisan class. Did the king hire the smith to make his weapons, or was the smith a part of the king's family, a kind of royal cousin who just happened to be good with fire? The answer probably depends on where you were. In some places, the smith might have been a humble servant, a tool of the powerful. In others, he might have been a chieftain in his own right. His power derived not from his family name, but from his skill with metal. The ringing of his hammer was not just the sound of a tool being made. It was the sound of a new social order being forged. You are now a student of the smith, an apprentice. Your hands are raw from working the bellows. Your face is grimy with soot. The air is thick with the smell of charcoal and sweat. The rhythmic ringing of the hammer on the anvil is the only sound you hear, a hypnotic beat that has been echoing through the ages. You're not just learning a trade, you're learning a way of life. You're learning the secrets of the earth and the fire. And in a few years, you too will be able to take a worthless pile of rocks and turn it into something that can feed a village, protect a family, and win a war. It's a peaceful, repetitive process that requires patience, skill, and a deep respect for the power of the elements. You are now an apprentice, no longer, but a master smith with a mind full of the secrets of fire and metal. The clanging of your hammer on the anvil is a familiar lullaby, and the glow of your furnace is a welcoming beacon in the darkness. But the bronze you make isn't always for simple tools. Sometimes a chieftain or a king wants something special, something intricate and beautiful. They want a hollow sculpture, a highly decorated ceremonial vessel, or a complex weapon with a hollow handle. For this, you can't just pour molten metal into a stone mold. You need a much more sophisticated technique. You need the lost wax casting method. This is a mainstream historical fact. The lost wax method, or cire perdue in French, is a technique that has been used for thousands of years to create incredibly detailed and complex metal objects. The process is a bit like making a cake, but instead of baking it, you're melting it. First, you would carve the object you want to create out of beeswax. This is the fun part. You get to be an artist, shaping the soft, pliable wax into a perfect likeness of the final object. You can carve a beautiful hilt for a sword, a delicate face for a statue, or a complex pattern for a ritual bowl. The detail you can achieve in wax is far greater than what you could ever do with stone or wood. Once your wax model is complete, you would then cover it with a layer of clay. You would build a thick, protective shell around the wax, leaving a small opening at the top and a few vents for the wax to escape. You then heat this clay shell in a furnace. The wax, as its name implies, is lost. It melts and runs out of the vents, leaving a perfect, empty space inside the clay shell. The clay shell is then heated to a very high temperature, making it incredibly hard and durable. This is a crucial step. If the clay is not strong enough, it will crack under the pressure of the molten metal. The process is slow and requires a lot of patience. You can almost feel the gentle heat of the furnace as it slowly bakes your clay mold, transforming it from a soft, wet material into a rock-hard casing. Now comes the moment of truth. You turn the clay mold upside down, and through the opening at the top, you carefully pour your molten bronze. The liquid metal flows into the hollow space, filling every single nook and cranny that the wax once occupied. The air escapes through the vents, and the metal cools and hardens. Once it's cool, you break open the clay mold, and out comes your object. It's a bit like a surprise gift you made for yourself. The clay is gone, and in its place is a perfect, solid bronze object, a mirror image of the wax model you made. This is a very satisfying and somewhat magical process, turning a soft, waxy object into a hard, durable metal one. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that this process was often a one-shot deal. Because you had to break the clay mold to get the object out, you could only ever make one of them. This meant that every lost wax casting was a unique work of art, a one-of-a-kind creation. Historians still debate whether this was a deliberate choice or a technological limitation. Were they so focused on making unique pieces that they never bothered to invent a reusable mold? Or was it simply impossible to create a two-part mold that could handle the heat and pressure of the molten bronze? The answer, like so many others, is lost to the ages. But what we do know is that this technique allowed the Bronze Age smith to create some of the most beautiful and intricate works of art that have ever been made, a testament to the creativity and ingenuity of these ancient craftspeople. The lost wax method you've just perfected is an amazing skill, a way to create one-of-a-kind masterpieces for the elite. But it's not how most of the bronze tools and weapons were made. The average person, the common farmer or warrior, didn't have a beautiful, intricate sword made with a complex, lost wax hilt. They had something more practical, more reliable, and much easier to produce. They had tools made with simple, open mold casting. You are now a smith focused on mass production, turning out tools for the masses, not just the kings. A mainstream historical fact is that the most common method for making simple bronze objects was using open molds. These molds were usually made of stone, sometimes clay, and were incredibly simple. You would carve the shape of the tool you wanted, an axe head, a chisel, a spearhead, into a flat piece of stone. This was the mold. You would then heat this stone mold to get rid of any moisture, which would prevent the molten bronze from splattering and ruining your work. Then you would simply pour the molten bronze into the carved-out cavity. The molten metal would fill the space, and as it cooled, it would harden into the shape of your tool. The process was crude, but effective. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that these molds were often reused many times. A single stone mold could be used to cast dozens or even hundreds of axe heads. This made the production of bronze tools much more efficient and accessible to a wider range of people. It was a factory of one, with you, the smith, as the sole operator. The sound of the molten bronze pouring into the stone mold would have been a soft hissing sound, followed by the gentle crackle of the cooling metal. It's a peaceful, repetitive process, a quiet rhythm of production that kept the tools flowing from the smithy to the village. Historians still debate whether the use of open molds was a sign of a less skilled craftsman or simply a matter of practicality. Was the open mold smith a kind of second-class citizen, a worker who didn't have the skills of a lost wax artist? Or was he simply a pragmatic producer, a businessman who knew that the world needed more axe heads than hollow sculptures? The archaeological evidence suggests that both skills coexisted, with different smiths specializing in different things. The lost wax artist might have been seen as a kind of high priest, a magical figure, while the open mold smith was the workhorse of the village, the person who made sure everyone had the tools they needed to survive. You are now working with a simple stone mold, pouring the molten bronze with a steady hand. The air is filled with the smell of hot metal and stone. You're not making a masterpiece. You're making a tool that will help a farmer clear a field, a weapon that will help a warrior protect his family. It's a humble, honest kind of work, and there's a certain satisfaction in it. The finished axe head might not be as beautiful as a lost wax statue, but it's much more important. It's the kind of tool that changes the world, one swing at a time. The quiet hum of the cooling metal is a gentle lullaby, a sound of progress and peace. You've now created a tool, a rough bronze axe head, but it's not ready to use just yet. The casting process, whether it's in a simple open mold or a complex lost wax one, leaves the metal with a rough, uneven surface. The edges are blunt, the blade is dull, and there are often small bumps and imperfections left over from the mold. The final step, before the tool can be used, is a painstaking, time-consuming process of polishing and finishing the bronze. This is where the rough, lumpy casting becomes a sharp, beautiful, and functional object. It's the difference between a raw piece of wood and a finished piece of furniture, and it's a difference you can feel in your hands. The mainstream historical fact here is that this finishing work was incredibly important. The raw casting from the mold was not only rough, but it was also relatively soft. The process of hammering and polishing, a technique known as work hardening, was essential. You would take the bronze tool and, using a smooth, rounded stone hammer, you would gently but firmly tap the surface. This hammering would compress the metal structure, making it harder and stronger. It's a bit like making a cookie dough tougher by kneading it. The more you worked the metal, the harder it became. This was especially important for the cutting edge of a tool, which needed to be razor sharp and durable. After the hammering came the polishing. You would use a series of finer and finer stones, a bit like modern-day sandpaper, to grind away the rough surface. You'd start with a coarse, gritty stone to remove the major imperfections, then move on to a smoother one to get a polished surface. The final step might involve using a very fine, smooth stone and some sand and water to give the bronze a beautiful, gleaming finish. This polishing wasn't just for looks. A smooth surface meant less friction, which made a tool more efficient. A polished axe head would glide through wood more easily, and a polished spearhead would fly through the air more smoothly. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the final polish on some ceremonial objects was so fine that the bronze would gleam like gold. This was a deliberate choice, a way of signaling the wealth and power of the owner. These highly polished bronze objects would catch the firelight and sparkle, creating a sense of awe and wonder. They were not just tools or weapons. They were works of art, a symbol of a culture that had moved beyond simple survival and into the realm of beauty and aesthetics. Historians still debate how important the aesthetic quality of a tool was to the average person. Did a farmer care if his bronze axe was highly polished, or did he just care that it was sharp and strong? The answer is probably a bit of both. The aesthetic appeal of a tool might not have been a priority for the average person, but for the elite, for the warriors and chieftains, a beautifully finished weapon was a sign of their status and a reflection of their power. The quiet, rhythmic scraping of the polishing stone, the gentle clinking of the hammer. These were the sounds of a society that was getting ready to take its next big step. You are putting the final touches on a tool, making it ready for its long life of work, and in doing so, you are putting the finishing touches on an entire era. The polished bronze tool you just finished is now ready for its life of use. But a good number of the bronze artifacts you're asked to create aren't for everyday work. They're not simple axes or chisels. They're for the powerful, for the elite, and they serve a very different purpose. This is where the bronze dagger, a status symbol, enters the picture. It's a fascinating object because its initial purpose was not to be a better weapon, but to be a better decoration. It's an object that whispers of wealth and power, even before it's ever used in a fight. A mainstream historical fact is that the first bronze daggers were a direct evolution from earlier flint and stone daggers. They were short, relatively small, and were often more about aesthetics than practicality. The initial design was so simple that it could be cast in a basic open-faced mold and then hammered and polished to a beautiful sheen. But the real change wasn't in the design of the blade, it was in the material. A flint dagger could be beautiful, but a bronze one was something else entirely. It was a metal that gleamed and shone, and it was a direct representation of the immense wealth and power required to acquire it. The mere act of owning a bronze dagger was a declaration of your place in society. It was the ancient equivalent of driving a luxury car. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that many of these early daggers show very little evidence of ever being used in combat. They often have intricate decorations on the hilt, beautiful engravings on the blade, and they lack the nicks and scratches you would expect from a weapon that has been in a real fight. They were often buried with their owners, completely unused, a testament to their role as a ceremonial object, a symbol of a life of privilege and importance. They were a bit like a modern-day trophy, something you had to show off, not something you had to use. Historians still debate whether this focus on ceremonial weapons was a sign of a more peaceful period in the early Bronze Age, or if it was simply a sign that these early daggers were not very good weapons. Was the focus on beauty a sign that people didn't need to fight, or a sign that their weapons weren't yet good enough to be truly useful in a serious battle? The answer is probably a mix of both. The early daggers were not as strong as later ones, and a good flint blade might have still been a more reliable option in a fight. But the bronze dagger was a sign of a new kind of power, a power based not on physical strength or skill, but on control of resources and wealth. So, as you drift off, imagine yourself as a chieftain holding a beautiful, polished bronze dagger. It's heavy in your hand, and the light from the fire dances on its surface. You're not thinking about a fight. You're thinking about your place in the world. You're thinking about the men who mined the copper and the tin, the smith who spent days hammering and polishing, and the vast network of trade that brought it all together. The dagger in your hand is not just a weapon. It is a story, a history, and a promise. It is the sound of a new age, and it is a peaceful sound that lulls you to sleep. The bronze dagger in your hand, a symbol of your power, is a beautiful and elegant object. But it's not a weapon for a real battle. It's for ceremony and for show. The true weapon of the Bronze Age, the one that would change the nature of warfare forever, is still to come. The short, ceremonial dagger would eventually evolve into something much more formidable. The Bronze Age sword. This is where the metallurgy you've been learning truly comes into its own, creating a tool of both immense power and deadly purpose. A mainstream historical fact is that the development of the bronze sword was a major technological leap. A sword is much longer and thinner than a dagger, which means it is much more susceptible to bending or breaking. To make a functional sword, you needed to master the alloy, getting the perfect mix of copper and tin to create a metal that was both hard enough to hold an edge and flexible enough to withstand the stress of a sword fight. The first swords were often just elongated daggers, but they quickly evolved into a much more specialized weapon. They had long, leaf-shaped blades, and they were often decorated with intricate patterns. They were a direct result of the smith's mastery of his craft. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Bronze Age sword was often designed to be used in a very specific way. The most common swords of the era were not for slashing, but for thrusting. They were designed to be used in a very tight, close-quarters combat style, where a warrior would thrust the sword into an opponent's unarmored areas. The hilts of these swords were often very ornate and complex, with a heavy pommel that would act as a counterweight. This made the sword feel balanced and fast, even though it was made of a relatively heavy metal. The sword wasn't just a tool. It was an extension of the warrior's arm, a part of his body. Historians still debate what drove the innovation of the sword. Was it a result of a change in warfare, with larger armies and more complex tactics? Or did the invention of the sword itself change the way wars were fought? It's a classic chicken and egg problem. Did the demand for a better weapon lead to the development of the sword, or did the availability of a better weapon lead to a change in military tactics? The answer is probably a bit of both. The sword was a status symbol, of course, but it was also a very real and very deadly weapon. It was a tool that could decide the fate of a battle and the fate of an entire kingdom. The person who controlled the smiths and the tin that fed their furnaces was in a position of immense power. So, as you drift off, imagine yourself holding a newly forged bronze sword. It's still warm from the furnace, and the light from your fire dances on its polished surface. It's heavy, but balanced, and you can feel the immense power it contains. You're not just holding a piece of metal, you're holding a piece of history. You're holding a weapon that will change the world, a tool that will be used to create empires and to destroy them. It's a peaceful thought in its own way. The quiet sound of the cooling metal, the steady rhythm of your breathing, and the long history of warfare that is just beginning. The focus on swords and daggers might lead you to believe that the Bronze Age was all about warfare and status. And while those things were certainly important, the vast majority of the bronze being produced was for much more mundane, but no less crucial, purposes. The life of a farmer, a carpenter, or a leather worker was being slowly and quietly transformed by a new set of tools. You are now the smith who makes the tools for the common person, the person who needs to get a job done. A mainstream historical fact is that bronze tools revolutionized agriculture and daily life. A bronze axe, even a simple one, was far more efficient than a stone axe. A bronze sickle could harvest grain faster and with less effort than a flint one. Bronze chisels and saws allowed carpenters to build more complex and sturdy structures. Bronze awls and needles made working with leather and cloth much easier. These tools, while not as glamorous as a sword, were the true drivers of social change. They allowed people to produce more food, build better homes, and create more comfortable lives for themselves. The entire economic system of a village was being upgraded, one bronze tool at a time. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that many of these everyday tools were often recycled. Unlike stone tools, which were simply discarded when they broke, a broken bronze tool could be melted down and cast into a new one. This made bronze an incredibly valuable and sustainable resource. The oral landscape of a Bronze Age village would have included not only the ringing of a hammer on an anvil, but also the gentle hiss of a broken tool being thrown back into the furnace, ready to be reborn as something new. It was a world that had moved beyond simple consumption and into the world of resource management and recycling. Historians still debate whether this new efficiency led to a more prosperous and peaceful society, or if it simply freed up more time for warfare and conflict. Did the ability to grow more food lead to a population boom that increased social pressures, or did it lead to a more comfortable, stable way of life? The archaeological evidence is mixed, but what's clear is that the widespread availability of these tools changed everything. A farmer with a bronze axe could clear a field in a fraction of the time it would take with a stone one, and that extra time could be used for other things, for learning, for art, or for simply relaxing. The quiet, rhythmic sound of a bronze tool at work was the sound of progress. It's a gentle sound that lulls you to sleep, a sound of a world that is quietly and peacefully getting better. You've made tools for the farmers and weapons for the warriors. But there's one more category of metal goods that requires a different kind of mastery: armor. Making a sword is one thing, but making a shield or a breastplate is a whole other puzzle. It's a project that is less about creating a single tool and more about creating a large, durable surface that can withstand a blow. This is the armor-making puzzle. A mainstream historical fact is that early Bronze Age armor was rare and was exclusively for the elite. It was often a simple breastplate, a single piece of bronze that covered the chest, and perhaps a small, circular shield. Unlike a sword, which could be cast in a mold, a breastplate was often made by a process called sheet metal working. This involved taking a large, flat ingot of bronze and hammering it relentlessly until it was thin enough to be shaped into a curved piece of armor. The process was incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and required a lot of skill. You had to hammer the metal evenly without making it so thin that it became brittle or so thick that it became too heavy to wear. It was a delicate dance between strength and flexibility. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the earliest bronze shields were often not used for blocking blows. Instead, they were used to deflect them. The design of these shields, with their concentric circles and raised bosses, was meant to catch a spear or a sword and turn the blow away from the warrior's body. They were as much about a psychological intimidation as they were about physical protection. The sight of a warrior with a gleaming bronze shield, its surface catching the light and reflecting it in the face of an enemy, would have been a terrifying sight. The sound of a blow deflecting off the surface of the shield, a loud clank that echoed across the battlefield, would have been a powerful psychological weapon. Historians still debate whether the rarity of bronze armor was due to technological limitations or social ones. Was it simply too difficult to make large pieces of armor, or was it a deliberate choice by the elite to keep such protection for themselves? The archaeological record shows that armor was often buried with its owner, a sign of its immense value and a testament to its role as a status symbol. The sound of a smith hammering a breastplate, a long, rhythmic thud that goes on for days, is a sound of immense patience and skill. It's the sound of a person who is not just making a tool, but making a symbol of power, a shield against the world. It's a peaceful, repetitive sound that helps you to drift off to sleep, a sound of protection and power. The armor you just finished is a masterpiece, a symbol of immense wealth and power. But a breastplate is made of bronze, and bronze is made of copper and tin. And as you've learned, tin is a very difficult substance to find. This scarcity of tin and the uneven distribution of both copper and tin ores led to a phenomenon that would define the entire era: the global bronze trade. This wasn't a casual exchange of goods. It was a complex, interconnected system that linked distant cultures and fueled an economic boom. A mainstream historical fact is that the Bronze-Age trade routes were some of the first truly international economic networks. Copper from Cyprus was traded for tin from Cornwall, a journey that would take a trader thousands of miles and many months. The tin from Afghanistan was traded for copper from Iran. The routes weren't just over land either. The Mediterranean Sea, the North Sea, and the Atlantic Ocean became highways of commerce, with ships laden with metal ingots sailing from port to port. The trade was so extensive that archaeologists have found ingots of tin and copper from a shipwreck in the Mediterranean that matched the chemical signature of mines in distant lands, a testament to the sheer scale of this trade. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the most common form of currency in this trade wasn't gold or silver, but ingots of metal themselves. These ingots, often shaped like an oxide with 4 handles, were a standardized form of currency. They could be easily carried, and their weight and purity could be easily verified. The sound of these metal ingots clinking against each other as they were loaded and unloaded from a ship would have been a kind of music to the ears of a merchant, a symphony of wealth and power. Historians still debate whether these ingots were a true form of money or just a standardized weight for trade. But what's clear is that they were a powerful symbol of the new economic order. This vast network of trade created a new kind of society, one that was no longer isolated and self-sufficient. A chieftain in what is now modern-day Germany might have a sword made from tin that came from Britain and copper that came from Spain. He would be connected, however distantly, to the people who mined the ore, the merchants who shipped it, and the smith who forged it. This created a sense of shared culture and shared technology that helped to define the entire era. The slow, creaking sound of a ship's timber, the gentle splash of water against the hull. These were the sounds of a new kind of world being born. It's a peaceful thought, the idea of people from different cultures, different lands, all working together for a common purpose, a shared desire for a better tool, a stronger weapon, and a more prosperous life. The bronze trade you've just imagined was a vast network, and at the heart of that network were the ships that carried the precious cargo. These weren't just any ships, they were often specialized vessels, built for a single purpose, to transport heavy, valuable metal ingots across the treacherous seas. This is the story of the mystery of ancient trade ships. A mainstream historical fact is that the primary evidence for these ships comes from shipwrecks. The most famous of these is the Elusive shipwreck, discovered off the coast of modern-day Turkey. This shipwreck is a time capsule from the late Bronze Age, and it contained a staggering amount of cargo. It was a massive haul, a testament to the immense value of the goods being traded. The cargo included over 10 tons of copper ingots, more than a ton of tin ingots, and a wide variety of other goods, including glass beads, elephant tusks, and even some gold. It was a king's ransom, all lost to the sea in a single moment. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the ingots themselves often had a very specific shape. The copper ingots were often shaped like an oxide, with a handle at each corner. This shape wasn't just for aesthetics, it was a clever bit of engineering. The handles made the heavy ingots easier to carry, and their shape meant they could be stacked and lashed together on a ship, preventing them from shifting in the rough seas. The tin ingots, on the other hand, were often shaped like an hourglass or a bread loaf, which was also a standardized shape that made them easy to identify and trade. The sound of these ingots being loaded onto a ship, a rhythmic clanking and thudding, would have been the soundtrack of a thriving economy. Historians still debate the exact routes of these ships and the identity of the people who sailed them. Were they Mycenaean, Greeks, Phoenicians, or another culture entirely? The cargo of the Uluburun shipwreck contains artifacts from a dozen different cultures, suggesting a multi-ethnic crew, or at least a ship that was part of a truly global network. The mystery of these ships is part of what makes the Bronze Age so fascinating. The ships were not just a means of transport, they were a symbol of the new world, a world that was getting smaller and more interconnected by the day. So, as you drift off to sleep, imagine yourself as a sailor on one of these ships. The stars are your only guide, and the gentle rocking of the boat is a lullaby. You're sailing across a vast, dark sea, a sea that is both a highway and a grave. You're a part of a network of people, a network of trade, and a network of knowledge that is changing the world. The sounds of the sea, the creak of the wood, and the distant cries of the gulls are a peaceful sound that lulls you to sleep. The bronze sword is a masterpiece. The bronze armor is a symbol of power, and the bronze tools have revolutionized daily life. But the impact of bronze wasn't just on the tools people used. It was on the people themselves. The control of this new technology created a fundamental shift in the way society was organized. The Age of Bronze wasn't just a period of new metal. It was a period of new social structures. This is the social hierarchy of bronze. A mainstream historical fact is that the Bronze Age saw the rise of a new social class, the elite, the people who had access to the copper and tin, the people who could afford the long-distance trade, and the people who controlled the smiths were suddenly in a position of immense power. They were no longer just the village elders or the strongest hunters. They were a new kind of royalty, a warrior aristocracy. They wore the bronze armor, they carried the bronze swords, and they ruled over a society that was increasingly dependent on them for its prosperity and protection. The rest of society, the farmers and the common workers, were now a part of a larger, more complex social structure, one in which their labor was used to support the elite. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that this new social structure was often reflected in burial practices. In earlier periods, burials were often fairly egalitarian, with everyone receiving a similar treatment in death. But in the Bronze Age, you start to see a stark difference. The elite were buried with a wealth of grave goods there: bronze swords, their ceremonial daggers, their polished pottery, and their expensive jewelry. The common people, on the other hand, were buried with very little. This difference in burial goods is a silent testament to the vast social chasm that had opened up between the haves and the have-nots. The dead were a reflection of the living, and the dead of the Bronze Age showed a society that was anything but equal. Historians still debate whether this new social hierarchy was a natural result of the new technology, or if it was a deliberate choice by the elite to consolidate their power. Did the bronze sword create the warrior king, or did the warrior king seize control of the bronze? It's another one of those big, unanswerable questions. But what is clear is that the world of the Bronze Age was a world of immense power and immense inequality. The slow, rhythmic sound of a bronze sword being polished, the quiet gleam of a bronze breastplate, these were not just the sounds and sights of a new technology. They were the sounds and sights of a new social order, a quiet and peaceful end to the egalitarianism of the past. It's a sad thought in a way, but it is a real one, a thought that helps you drift off to sleep. The new social hierarchy you just imagined, with its powerful elite and its common workers, had a leader, and that leader was often a warrior. The bronze sword and the bronze armor were not just symbols, they were tools of control. The person who had the best weapons and the most armor was the person who could enforce their will on others. This is the era of the rise of warrior kings. A mainstream historical fact is that the Bronze Age saw the emergence of powerful, centralized states ruled by a single dominant figure. These figures, often referred to as warrior kings or chieftains, gained their power not just from their lineage or their charisma, but from their control of the tools of war. They would control the flow of copper and tin, the workshops of the smiths, and the armies that wielded the bronze weapons. They were not just political leaders, they were military commanders, and their power was absolute. The quiet, peaceful, agrarian villages of the past were slowly being absorbed into larger, more complex political entities, and the person at the top of that pyramid was a warrior with a bronze sword. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the homes of these warrior kings were often highly fortified with thick walls and complex defensive structures. These were not just homes, they were castles, fortresses that were built to withstand a siege. The archaeological record shows a clear shift in architecture during this period, with a move away from simple, open villages to well-defended, walled settlements. This suggests a period of increasing conflict and a need for protection. The sound of a hammer on a bronze sword, the rhythmic thud of a shield being polished. These were not just the sounds of a new technology. They were the sounds of a new political reality, a reality in which power was measured in bronze. Historians still debate whether these warrior kings were a force for good or for evil. Did they bring stability and prosperity to their people, or did they simply use their power to exploit them? The answer, as always, is probably a mix of both. A strong leader could protect a village from raiders, but a greedy one could just as easily enslave them. The bronze sword was a double-edged tool, and the person who wielded it had the power to be a hero or a villain. The quiet hum of a furnace, the rhythmic beat of a hammer, these were the sounds of a new kind of power being forged, a power that was both a blessing and a curse. The Bronze Age, with its gleaming swords, powerful kings, and vast trade networks, seems like a period that would last forever. But all ages must come to an end, and the end of the Bronze Age was as mysterious and dramatic as its beginning. You are now a witness to the slow, quiet decay of a civilization built on metal. This is the end of the Bronze Age. A mainstream historical fact is that the end of the Bronze Age was marked by a period of widespread collapse, often referred to as the Bronze Age collapse. Sometime around the 12th century BCE, a number of powerful civilizations in the Near East, the Mediterranean, and Europe suddenly and mysteriously collapsed. The Mycenaean civilization in Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, and the new Kingdom of Egypt were all severely weakened or completely destroyed. Cities were burned, trade routes were abandoned, and the intricate network of international relations you just imagined simply ceased to exist. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the cause of this collapse is one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in history. The collapse was so widespread and so sudden that historians have proposed a number of different theories, none of which seem to fully explain what happened. Some scholars point to a massive drought that led to widespread famine. Others suggest a series of invasions by mysterious raiders known as the Sea Peoples. Still others argue for a combination of earthquakes, internal rebellions, and the disruption of the tin trade. The truth is probably a combination of all of these things, a kind of perfect storm of disasters that brought an end to an entire era. Historians still debate the primary cause of the collapse. Was it climate change that led to famine, or was it the disruptions of warfare that led to the collapse of the trade routes? The archaeological record shows a world that suddenly became much more chaotic and much less interconnected. The quiet, rhythmic sound of a caravan moving across the desert, the gentle creak of a ship's timber, these were replaced by the sounds of chaos, conflict, and silence. The end of the Bronze Age was a slow, sad, and very quiet affair. The furnaces went cold, the trade routes went silent, and the bronze swords were eventually replaced by a new, humbler metal that would change the world all over again. The bronze swords are now silent, the furnaces are cold, and the great cities lie in ruins. The age of bronze is over, but that doesn't mean the world has gone back to stone tools. Another metal, one that had been lurking in the shadows for centuries, would now take center stage. This is the Iron Age's humble beginning. A mainstream historical fact is that iron, unlike copper and tin, is incredibly common. It's one of the most abundant elements on Earth, and it's found almost everywhere, but it's much more difficult to work with. Iron ore requires a much hotter furnace to smelt, and it can't be easily cast in a mold like bronze. It melts at a scorching 1,538 degrees Celsius, a temperature that was impossible to achieve with the simple pit furnaces of the Bronze Age. This meant that the first iron tools weren't cast, they were hammered. The blacksmith would heat the iron ore in a charcoal furnace, but instead of melting it, he would create a spongy, semi-molten mass known as a bloom. This bloom would then be hammered relentlessly to squeeze out the impurities, a process known as forging. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the first iron tools were not seen as superior to bronze. In fact, they were often worse. They were brittle, uneven, and they would rust. The early ironworkers were not the revered, magical figures that the bronze smiths were. They were often just people who had to make do with what they had. And what they had was a metal that was difficult to work with and didn't seem to be as good as the old stuff. Iron was a poor man's metal. A consolation prize after the glorious bronze was no longer available. Historians still debate where and how the technology for working with iron was first discovered. Was it a deliberate invention, or was it a gradual process of learning to work with a different kind of ore? The archaeological record shows a very slow, gradual transition from bronze to iron. In the early stages, you'd often find a bronze sword with an iron hilt or a bronze axe with an iron blade. This suggests a period of experimentation, a period in which people were trying to figure out how to best use this new, strange, and difficult metal. The quiet, rhythmic sound of a blacksmith's hammer, the roar of the furnace, these were the sounds of a new age being born. An age that would eventually be defined by this humble, common, and incredibly difficult metal. The first iron tools you've seen, the ones forged from that difficult, spongy bloom, might have been a bit of a disappointment. They were brittle, they rusted, and they were a pain to make. But iron had two crucial advantages over bronze. And it's these advantages that would eventually lead to the end of the Bronze Age and the dawn of the Iron Age proper. This is a look at iron's advantages and disadvantages. A mainstream historical fact is that the most significant advantage of iron was its abundance. While tin was incredibly rare and had to be shipped across vast distances, iron ore was found almost everywhere. This meant that the technology of metalworking was no longer tied to the complex international trade networks of the Bronze Age. A village could, in theory, find its own iron ore, smelt it in its own furnace, and forge its own tools and weapons. This democratized metallurgy. The power of metal was no longer the exclusive domain of the elite. It was now available to a much wider range of people. But iron was not without its disadvantages. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the first iron swords were often worse than the bronze ones they replaced. They were often brittle, and they didn't hold a sharp edge as well. This is because the early ironworkers didn't know how to create steel, which is an alloy of iron and carbon. They were just working with pure iron, which is a relatively soft and malleable metal. It took centuries of experimentation, of learning how to control the amount of carbon in the iron, to create a metal that was truly superior to bronze. Historians still debate whether the advantages of iron were enough to cause the collapse of the Bronze Age trade networks, or if if the collapse of the trade networks was what forced people to start using iron in the first place. Did the Iron Age end the Bronze Age, or did the end of the Bronze Age create the Iron Age? It's a question of cause and effect. But what is clear is that the move from bronze to iron was not a sudden, clean break. It was a long, slow, and often difficult transition. The quiet, rhythmic sound of a blacksmith's hammer, the gentle hiss of a new metal being cooled, these were the sounds of a new age being born. An age that would eventually be defined by this humble, common, and incredibly difficult metal. The Iron Age may have eclipsed the Age of Bronze, but that doesn't mean the legacy of bronze has been forgotten. The metal you spent so much time learning to make, the alloy that revolutionized the world, has left an indelible mark on our history and our culture. This is the legacy of bronze. A mainstream historical fact is that bronze didn't just disappear. Even after iron became the dominant metal for tools and weapons, bronze continued to be used for things where its unique properties were an advantage. Bronze is more corrosion resistant than iron, which makes it an excellent choice for things that will be exposed to water, like ship fittings and bells. It's also a much better material for creating intricate, decorative objects. The beautiful statues and sculptures of the classical world were often made of bronze, a testament to its beauty and its ability to hold a fine detail. Bronze was not a failed technology. It was just a specialized one. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the word bronze itself has a fascinating history. Its etymology is a bit of a mystery, but one theory suggests it comes from the ancient Persian word berenj, which meant copper. The word was then adopted by the Italians as bronzo and eventually made its way into English. The word itself is a kind of echo, a whisper from the ancient world that has been passed down through the ages. It's a word that connects us to the people who first discovered this metal, the people who worked with it, and the people who fought with it. Historians still debate whether the legacy of bronze is more technological or cultural. Did the Bronze Age's main contribution to history lie in the development of metallurgy, or in the social and political structures it created? The answer is probably both. The skills of smelting, alloying, and casting that were developed in the Bronze Age were the foundation upon which all later metallurgy was built. But the social hierarchies, the international trade networks, and the rise of powerful states that were created by the bronze trade were just as important. The quiet, rhythmic sound of a bell ringing, a sound that is as old as civilization itself, is a direct echo of the Bronze Age, a sound that reminds us of the power and the beauty of this ancient metal. The bronze trade has come and gone. The warrior kings have faded into legend, and the Iron Age is now in full swing. But as we reach the end of our journey, let's take one last moment to appreciate the beauty and the skill of the people who lived in this remarkable age. The story of bronze isn't just a story about a new metal. It's a story about a new way of thinking, a new way of living, and a new way of seeing the world. This is our final stop, a reflection on the peaceful echoes of the past. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the skills and techniques developed in the Bronze Age were not lost. They were adapted and improved upon in the Iron Age and beyond. The lost wax casting method, the techniques for creating alloys, the methods for forging and finishing metal, all of these skills were passed down from generation to generation. The quiet, rhythmic sound of a hammer on an anvil, the hypnotic glow of a furnace, these were not just the sounds of one era. They were the sounds of a continuous human story. The smiths of the Iron Age were standing on the shoulders of the smiths of the Bronze Age, and we are standing on their shoulders. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some cultures, the knowledge of bronze making was so revered that it was considered a sacred art, a gift from the gods. The people who practiced it were not just craftspeople, they were priests, shamans, and healers. The metal itself was seen as a living thing, a gift from the earth that had a spirit and a soul. The process of smelting and forging was not just a job. It was a ritual, a communion with the divine. The quiet hum of a furnace, the gentle hiss of cooling metal. These were the sounds of a spiritual practice, a way of connecting with the deeper forces of the universe. Historians still debate whether the Bronze Age should be seen as a stepping stone to the Iron Age or as a complete and separate cultural epoch in its own right. Was it just a period of transition, or was it a time of immense cultural and technological achievement that deserves to be celebrated on its own terms? The answer, like so many others, is up to you to decide. For now, you can just lie back and think about the people who lived in this remarkable time. The quiet, rhythmic sound of their labor, the gentle glow of their furnaces, and the deep, peaceful stillness of their night are now yours to enjoy. So, as the embers of our story die down and the quiet of the night settles around you, you can rest easy knowing that the echoes of the Bronze Age are still all around us. In the quiet hum of a distant fan, in the soft glow of a street lamp, and in the rhythmic sound of your own breathing, you can still hear the sounds of a time when a few brave people took a rock from the ground and turned it into a new world. The journey is over, the story is complete, and it is time for you to let go. The world of bronze is a quiet and peaceful place now, and it is waiting for you to dream in it.